ya won't go on your day, ya won't go lodina shonia, ya won't go sojina weha, uyahine gana uyahea.
Sigoli. Hello everyone, welcome to Ukwakwa, our foods. Today we're going to show you how we dry and braid our squash for long-term storage. While winter squash has a remarkable shelf life on her own, dried squash takes up less space and is more portable for sharing. We hope to have more on our foods in future videos, so be sure to subscribe to our channel and click on notifications for new uploads. Ever since Europeans landed on our eastern shores, they wrote extensively about indigenous peoples' agricultural accomplishments and ability to store massive amounts of food. For example, communities could store 7 years or more worth of food in case of an emergency or disaster in their community or in a neighboring community. To do this, we had to perfect many techniques for long-term storage of our foods. One of the most common methods was drying foods. For drying and braiding squash, I start by cutting the squash in half. Then, I scoop the seeds and pulp out. Stay tuned for a future video about saving squash seeds for planting. I put the squash half cut side down and work my way around the squash to cut off the rind, being careful to not cut off too little or too much rind. After I cut the rind off, I go around and check to make sure I got it all off. Then I put the squash on her side and slice rings of squash off. I try to keep the slices about 3/4 of an inch thick. For softer, easier to cut squash, I can cut the pieces about a 1/2 inch thick. Any thinner than that and the squash will be too brittle. Too thick and the squash might not dry out properly. The more consistent the cuts, the more even the squash will dry out and the neater your braids will be. After the rings are all cut off, there are a number of ways to dry the squash. Two of the most common ways are hanging the pieces to dry or by using a food dehydrator. I'm sure you could even smoke the squash, although we haven't tried that yet. For the squash, I set my temperature at 135 degrees and set the time for 8 hours and check on it. Sometimes they need an extra 2 to 4 hours. As a side note, if at any point in the process you want to give up on your nice squash slices, you can always cut them up into cubes and put your squash chunks in the dehydrator. When they're dried out, you can put them in a mason jar for storage. Deciding when the squash is ready for braiding can be a bit tricky. I look for a pliable rope-like texture, almost like licorice. If the squash gets too dried out and brittle, you can take a spray bottle of water and mist the pieces for a little bit. If the squash is not dried out enough, it could mold and rot. When the squash is ready to braid, I break the squash rings open to have a single squash rope. I tie 3 pieces with waxed thread. Any food-safe thread, small rope, or a rubber band will work. I make the string a little longer so I can tie it down to something, like the back of a kitchen chair. Then I begin braiding, adding in new pieces as the existing pieces start to run out. As I braid the squash, I want to share something I read when looking at some of our stories that Oneida people collected from each other starting in the late 1930s. This recollection is from Rachel Denny. We strive to help rekindle those stories and practices. I still remember when I was 5 years old. Our house did not have any floor, only a fireplace made out of field stones. We had a table and shelves nailed onto the wall. We had 1 window and 1 door, but we had lots of food that we had stored up. Dried corn, dried fruit, dried meat, dried fish, beans, and dried pumpkin. Springtime we would have maple syrup and maple sugar. Upstairs there were shelves, and that's where the maple sugar was stacked up. We just started drying out our squash last year and have used it in soups and casseroles. Our favorite so far is including it in ground venison and wild rice casserole. We're still learning about our foods. People have different ways of preparing and storing our foods. We're sharing the way we learned how. One of the most amazing parts about this journey to get to know our foods better is that it is connecting us to so many people throughout the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and throughout Indian country. If you have any methods you want to share, please feel free to drop them in the comments or send us an email. Yawa, Danito.